I think should resonate with some of you, but not appreciated, frankly, by many advanced country CEOs and boards, is that there has been an incredible growth in the sophistication of purchasing decisions in emerging markets. Increasingly, we see that purchases, whether by individuals, whether by governments in terms of public procurement, whether in terms of companies, in terms of industrial machinery, those purchases are made less and less based in terms of what's cheapest off the shelf and more in terms of based upon a life cycle price. And I'll give you one example. I did a book several years ago called Africa's Silk Road, China and India's New Economic Frontier, which I think has had some impression on the leadership in Beijing to begin to think about this One Belt, One Road. But one of the case studies that we looked at in this book is small but extremely powerful. And it's the case of blankets being sold in kiosks in South Africa. And this was a case study we spent about a day looking at. And what occurred beginning about a decade and a half ago is the Chinese began to sell in kiosks very inexpensive blankets with African designs, and the Africans bought these blankets because they were extraordinarily inexpensive. The problem was that once you wash these blankets, they shrank and the dye ran out. And the African population in South Africa began to refer to these blankets as the wash and cry blankets. What happens? The Indian blanket manufacturers come into the market and they make a higher quality blanket that didn't shrink, the dye didn't run out, and what happened was you saw the Indians take away market share from the Chinese. They were charging a higher price for a higher quality good. At the most basic level, that is going on in terms of these trade-offs of making purchases on a life cycle basis, again, whether it's at the firm level or not. So it's not, economic incentives work and people's purchasing decisions are becoming more and more rational, more sophisticated in emerging markets than I think people understand. Which will not be surprising to anyone is obviously there is corruption in emerging markets. Now, I bristle when I say that because I don't want to paint with a broad brush, and there is corruption, dare I say, in my own country, in the United States. There's corruption in other advanced countries. What I bristle about is statements that, gee, corruption in Bangladesh is worse than corruption in Turkey. I mean, I've been working in this field on measuring corruption for decades, and it's very difficult to tell which is worse. And frankly, it's besides the point. It's there, and the question is, how can you respond to that? How can you deal with it so that you can differentiate who are the stakeholders and fashion strategies to deal with this problem of corruption? So I would say that it's really important that when people say there's a lot of corruption in emerging markets, you got to double click, triple click, and look at advanced countries as well. Perhaps epitomized, let's say, by what the Chinese and the Indians and Brazilians are doing in let's say, in other Asian markets or African markets, is what they're doing is they recognize, because they themselves are emerging markets, is that there are cross-sectoral deficits in the development of these markets. And so what the Chinese have done extraordinarily well has been to go in arm in arm, different companies across sectors, and enter markets that way to fulfill that deficit. The US firms, take one example, this is a very alien concept. Imagine a GE hooking up with a Pfizer and hooking up with a textile producer and going arm in arm into a very poor country and say, this is a co-investment that we're going to do. They don't think about it in those ways, but the world has come to the point where advanced countries need to rebundle the way that they package their investment packages. And I would submit that what the Chinese have mastered, and they have some way of doing so easier than than the US because the state-owned enterprises are still very much dominant and mandate the way that these investments are structured, but they have recognized the secret sauce, which is you need to enter these emerging markets cross-sectorally, not just sector by sector. When I look at these countries, when I do deep dives in country after country, is I talk to the finance minister, I talk to the academics, I talk to businesses, I talk to consumer groups, and I get a feel for how these economies are actually functioning. And obviously no economy is perfect, right? But I think there is no substitute for on-the-ground intelligence, number one. Number two, what a lot of companies I don't think do well, to be honest, is serious reputational due diligence of people with whom they want to partner. And it's not just what lawyers do or what investment people like I do in terms of commercial due diligence, but who are the people really behind the people that you want to invest with? And I'll just give you one very, very quick example. I had a client, very well-known client, who I helped bring to Myanmar several years ago to set up a very sophisticated investment. And because of Myanmar's situation, in courtesy of the US WikiLeaks, leaked State Department memos, one of the generals, the former generals, was attached to, in the cable, as being an owner of the #1 most attractive plant that my client wanted to buy. And it's a prized asset. And we were hired to do the reputational due diligence on that plant and then 2 others that were of lesser quality. But we knew that plant #1 was off bounds because of the US law of being a special designated. We could not deal with that plant. But the more we dug into it, we found out that, in fact, going through corporate records, we spent about 3 weeks in Myanmar, in China, Singapore, where this general had a lot of investments. What we found out was he has actually no financial ties to this asset, to the prized asset. Huge first mover advantage for this client. But that's only because we dug deeply. And just because it's in WikiLeaks, which was then reprinted in the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, profile after profile of this general, it's a classic type 1 and type 2 error. So there's no substitute for that kind of work. The U.S. is concerned about what's happening in terms of Chinese investment in Latin America, but what they're more concerned about, frankly, is Chinese investment coming into this country. They're worried about Latin America in the sense that it's a backdoor. And this is why, if you look at NAFTA 2.0, and I've written a recent Forbes column on this, so if you have trouble sleeping tonight, go to my website and look up. There's several Forbes columns that will work wonders for you. But as we know from some of the press reports, the real point of NAFTA 2.0 is a poison pill to basically tell any of the 3 parties that if you begin to negotiate a free trade agreement with China, we're going to pull out of NAFTA 2.0. And that relates to the concern that this administration has about foreign direct investment coming into Mexico, but you can relate that to Latin America as well. But again, what's front and center now is CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., on which I sat during my days in the White House. And as we know, there's a new law now that is overseeing how the U.S. will make judgments about inbound foreign investment from China into the U.S., and that is going to be more and more stringent. African leaders are eyeing each other. And again, I don't want to overstate the problems in Africa or overstate the benefits of Africa, but for me, it is the sleeper area of the world that if you don't bet on Africa, 10 years from now, your board of directors is going to say, what the heck were you thinking in 2018 because you wrote off Africa?